Hey everyone, and welcome to the Bible Study Group. Today, we're going to embark on a really fascinating journey through the canonical Gospels. We're actually going to map out the geographical and the chronological roadmap of Jesus' ministry. We'll trace his literal steps, starting all the way up in the rolling, hopeful hills of Galilee, right down to the incredibly dense, historically heavy final week in Jerusalem. And by visualizing this, all those individual stories we know so well, they really start to lock together into one incredible, cohesive narrative.
Okay, let's dive into this. First things first, we gotta ground ourselves in the timeline. So based on the Gospel of Luke, plus some historical data we have around Emperor Tiberius, scholars generally place the start of Jesus' ministry somewhere around AD 27 to 29. From there, that massive Galilean ministry really takes off around AD 29. And all of this ultimately leads to the crucifixion in Jerusalem, which estimates puts somewhere between AD 30 and 36. So that kind of gives us the historical boundaries for our journey.
And here's our itinerary for this explainer. We're going to start with the baptism in early days, move up north for the Galilean ministry, head south for the journey to Jerusalem, and then finally arrive at the final Passion Week.
All right, Section 1, Baptism in early days down by the Jordan River. And right off the bat, it's pretty fascinating to note that the Gospel of Luke explicitly tells us Jesus was about 30 years of age when this public ministry kicked off.
So our narrative actually begins with John the Baptist, since his ministry served as the big precursor to Jesus's. The starting line is drawn right near the River Jordan. In fact, the Gospel of John points to a specific spot called Bethany beyond the Jordan. This location, down in the region of Perea, is basically the physical starting point of the whole ministry. It's marked by Jesus' baptism, and right after that, he heads out into the Judean desert to face his temptation before coming back to gather his very first followers.
Moving on to Section 2, the Galilean ministry. You can really think of this as a season of growth. We're shifting our narrative compass north into the region of Galilee.
And this brilliantly illustrates just how fast the movement spread across the region under Herod Antipas. It essentially happens in three ways. In the early phase, Jesus is operating heavily around Capernaum, calling his first disciples and delivering that foundational Sermon on the Mount. Then, as momentum really starts to build into the major phase, he formally commissions the 12 apostles and shifts his focus to teaching deeply through parables. Finally, right after the tragic death of John the Baptist, we hit the final Galilean phase. And this is marked by those massive, awe-inspiring public miracles, like feeding the 5,000 and walking on water.
Which brings us to Section 3, the journey to Jerusalem, or the turning point. And this is where the narrative hinge hits. The whole tone of the gospel shifts here from the hopeful, very public vibe of Galilee to something much more urgent and solemn as Jesus starts heading toward Judea and Perea.
The spark for this huge shift is a pretty profound conversation at Caesarea Philippi. Jesus asks his disciples, who they say he is. And Simon Peter steps up and delivers this massive quote, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." This is absolutely crucial. It's the ultimate theological pivot. Jesus blesses Peter, accepts those divine titles, and then immediately he begins predicting his own suffering and death in Jerusalem. So from this moment on, the shadow of the cross is literally falling over the rest of the journey.
Right on the heels of Peter's confession, we get the Transfiguration. Jesus takes Peter and two other apostles up an unnamed mountain, and suddenly he's transformed in this blinding glory, standing right there alongside the prophets Moses and Elijah. And then a voice from a bright cloud tells the apostles to listen to him. This breathtaking event completely cements the transition. We move from those early preaching days straight into the final, high-stakes mission toward Jerusalem. It's a massive reveal of his divine authority right before the absolute darkest part of his journey.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the stark contrast between these two distinct eras. Look at the Galilean ministry. The focus is entirely outward, right? Gathering massive crowds, doing huge public miracles, giving broad sermons. But as the journey turns toward Judea and Perea, the strategy totally flips. It becomes incredibly tense and deliberate. Jesus actually steps away from the crowds to focus intimately on preparing his 12 disciples. He emphasizes humility and repeatedly predicts his impending death. It is a completely focused march toward destiny.
And as Jesus draws closer to Jerusalem, we see the absolute pivotal catalyst that lights the fuse for the final confrontation, the raising of Lazarus in Bethany. Jesus literally brings Lazarus back to life 4 days after his burial. Now, because this specific miracle happens right outside Jerusalem, it is so undeniable that it draws these massive welcoming crowds. But at the exact same time, it sends Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin into an absolute panic. It's what pushes them to formally plan Jesus' death. The stage is totally set. Welcome to Section 4, the final Passion Week, the climax in Jerusalem. As we get into this final part of our explainer, we're going to intentionally slow down a bit to reflect on just how historically and theologically dense this single week really is.
Take a look at this data distribution, because it reveals a really surprising fact. Even though the Galilean and early Judean ministries covered literally years of time and huge stretches of territory, the Gospel accounts devote roughly 1/3 of their entire text to just this final week in Jerusalem. 33% of the story is laser-focused on just these few days. That incredible narrative weight really goes to show us just how vital the Passion Week was to the early church.
Let's move to and see how this builds. We'll carefully break down this dense sequence of events. The week kicks off with the triumphal entry, crowds welcoming Jesus down from the Mount of Olives. But things explode almost immediately with the cleansing of the temple, when Jesus drives out the money changers. Over the next few days, his really sharp criticisms of the religious elders lead straight to the betrayal. Judas Iscariot bargains to hand him over for 30 silver coins, basically setting a trap that all comes to a head at the Passover meal.
And that Passover meal is, of course, the Last Supper. This is it, the final teaching and preparation of the disciples before the agony in the garden and his eventual arrest. During this supper, we have the institution of the Eucharist, where Jesus breaks the bread and shares the cup, telling them it's his body and blood given for them. And if we look at the Gospel of John, this incredibly intense evening wraps up with the deeply moving farewell discourse, where he comforts the disciples right before his departure.
So the crucial point is, how does mapping all of this out actually change how we read our Bibles? How does tracing Jesus' steps from those expansive, hopeful hills of Galilee all the way to the solemn, incredibly deliberate cross in Jerusalem change our understanding of the Gospels? Seeing the ministry not just as random, isolated stories, but as a direct geographical and theological roadmap, it kind of changes everything, doesn't it? It shows a mission moving with absolute, unstoppable purpose. I'm going to leave you with that provocative thought to kick off your group discussion. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and have an absolutely wonderful Bible study.